there are just lessons that we can learn from failure that you simply can't learn from always being successful. And it's those lessons that I believe can make you who you want to be.
Hey everyone, I'm John Lowry. I am pleased to be your host of this new podcast, Fail It Forward, Lessons for Life, Leadership, and Turning Failure into Success. This episode, I want to simply lay the groundwork for the conversation that I hope we can have. As we think about failure, failure is something that all of us will experience at one moment in our life. It's something that, as we look at it, many people don't like to talk about their failures. So often, failure is taboo. Many times, people want to forget their failures. And yet, as I experience the learning journey of many leaders through my work here at Spark, Lipscomb's Idea Center, and then just working with leaders across the country, one of the things that I've learned is that failure is actually a great lesson for leaders. But failure is also a great tool to use in learning the things that you need to learn to ultimately be successful. My journey has involved a great bit of failure as well. Not everything that I set out to do has happened perfectly. There's been moments where there was a vision to do something that was really exciting and it frankly didn't work. My background is an attorney. And I spent a lot of my professional time thinking about how to help organizations work through lawsuits. Those are moments of failure. And one of the interesting things in working with organizations that find themselves facing litigation is the desire to just make it go away. And yet it's a fascinating paradox because there's moments there where true learning can take place, where the organization can get better. And yet, because there is such a desire to move on, there are lessons that are missed. And so here in this particular podcast, what I hope to do is to help us see failure in a different way, to help us understand that failure is just part of the human experience. And taking a healthy view of failure, number one, will give us a better opportunity to put failure in perspective. When we put failure in perspective, perhaps we won't be as afraid of failure, which then can lead us to taking the chances, to having the courage to do the things that we know are going to be hard things, but the things that will give significance and meaning to our lives. I hope that through this podcast, that you will hear very successful people who will come and be very transparent in terms of sharing their lessons that they've learned through failure. And by doing so, you will be in a position to take those lessons into your own life and to use them to make better decisions. Use them to move faster in terms of the pursuit of your dreams, and to use them to begin experiencing more and more levels of success. And so that's what this podcast is going to be about. It's going to be people telling stories about their life's journey, about the failures that they've experienced, and how those failures were transformed into success. Let me share with you a little bit about what this podcast is not. This is not going to be something to where we spend a lot of time glorifying failure. It's not going to be something to where we want to discourage people with stories of failure. It's not going to be a woe is me kind of moment. This is going to be something that's positive, to where we take failure as a stepping stone to success. But we've got to pause long enough to extract the really important lessons from it, and then think really creatively and really boldly about how we can take those lessons and translate those into great moments into our future. And so as we think about failure, I want to share with you just a few observations and a few stories from my own life that perhaps can give a broader perspective of failure. The first is that I've found failure to be counterintuitive. Now, you think about that for just a moment and you say, well, yeah, there's a lot of intuitiveness to failure. We know what failure means. Many times it means a lack of an opportunity. Sometimes it means a closed door. Sometimes it can mean a broken relationship. Sometimes it can mean the ability to, or I guess really the inability not to make the kind of money that we'd like to make. I mean, there are real consequences to failure. And I want to make sure that that is recognized as part of our conversation. But the real value of failure and the real opportunity that failure presents to us, there are dangers to it, but not just dangers. There are some opportunities to it as well. And that is the learning that can come from it. There are just lessons that we can learn from failure that you simply can't learn from always being successful. And it's those lessons that I believe can make you who you want to be. I grew up playing soccer. And when I was in the middle of playing soccer as a teenager, I had absolutely no idea the lessons that the game of soccer was teaching me. I was fortunate to be able to play at a relatively high level. I played through high school and went on and played college soccer as well. But I never won a championship. I never was named to any sort of national team or anything like that. I never experienced that kind of success. But I would absolutely not trade my experience for anyone else's soccer career because of the lessons that I learned through playing this game. I remember one of the first lessons I learned playing soccer was when I was about in middle school. I was about 13 or 14 years old. And I remember those days vividly. When you're living in that moment in life, your identity is so important. And my identity was all wrapped up in being a soccer player. That was my social network. That was what I loved to do. It's literally all that I thought about. School was something I had to do. Soccer was something that I wanted to do. And perhaps it was even a bit out of balance, but I loved playing that game. And I loved playing it with my group of friends. And there was a moment where everyone began to grow. And I was pretty late to grow. And it began to have a real impact because I got to a place to where I didn't start anymore. I got to a place to where I didn't even play anymore because I was smaller and I was slower because I simply didn't grow. I remember going to Dallas, Texas for the Dallas Cup. I was so excited to travel from my home in Southern California to Dallas for this very, very prestigious tournament. And I remember that through the entire tournament, I literally never got into a game. I never made an appearance. My parents paid all that money. We traveled over and I never got to play. And I remember thinking about the fact that I wasn't as good. And I remember fighting that battle of my own self-identification and the impact on my own self-esteem. And I remember thinking, not understanding why in the midst of this, I was not succeeding like I had in the past. And I knew that it was something that was kind of beyond my control, but that didn't make me feel any better. But here's what happened, is in the midst of that, I learned that I was gonna have to play harder, that I was gonna have to play much more aggressive, that I was gonna have to be tougher, and that I was gonna have to be absolutely fearless on the field if I was to overcome the fact that I was smaller than everyone else. And so a couple of years later, after the trauma of this moment, I remember my freshman year of high school, all of my friends, my entire team, they all made the varsity team. And guess what? Me and one other guy, we were left playing JV our freshman year. It was absolutely devastating. But it was in this moment, learning those things about grit and about hard work and about toughness, that when I did grow,
it allowed me not only to catch up with where everyone else was, but it allowed me to move past them to where I got to a place to where I had the opportunity to go and play college soccer. I got the opportunity to be part of a team that set the NCAA record for the most wins in history. It was a phenomenal experience. And I know that it never would have happened if I hadn't had that 2 or 3 year season where I struggled and where I failed and where success was hard to come by. It was in those moments that I learned what I needed to learn to become an effective soccer player. When I got to where I got to play college soccer at Wheaton College in Illinois, I joined a team that had just won the national championship in Division III soccer. I joined a team that, as I mentioned, was in the process of setting the NCAA record for the most consecutive wins in college soccer history. No one on this team had ever lost. Think about that for just a second. There was no one on this team that had ever lost in their collegiate soccer career. And here I came all the way from Southern California to join this team. It was an honor to get to play with them. We were ranked number 1 in the country all year. And I'll never forget the moment at East Macaulay Field in Wheaton, Illinois. We had set the NCAA record the night before. The next day, the NCAA moved up our game. We ended up going into the 4th overtime, which was a sudden death overtime. We were playing Trinity University out of San Antonio, Texas, and they ended up scoring a fluke goal, which brought everything to an end. The streak was over. The season was over. No longer were we undefeated. And here was this moment where I remember just sitting down on the field and the deafening silence of the 3,000 people that were there. Literally no one had experienced failure in years. We simply hadn't lost. And in the midst of that silence and in the midst of that despair, I will never forget our assistant coach, now the head coach at Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego, a gentleman by the name of Phil Wolf, who was absolutely furious with us. And he was getting all of us from wherever it was that we were lying on the field, and he was bringing us together as a team. And I'll never forget that moment where we got in that circle as a team, and he looked at us and he looked at us in the eyes and he said, "Gentlemen, I don't ever want you to forget this moment." Now, it seemed so counterintuitive because this was the worst moment. It wasn't the best moment. And yet here's a moment where coach is saying, don't ever, ever forget this moment. And he said, here's the lesson that I want you to take with you for the rest of your lives. He said, for 66 games and for the past 3 years, you've been able to end every single game victorious. And in the midst of that victory, you have taken the time to congratulate your opponent, to show respect to your opponent. You've taken the time to thank your fans and to show respect for your fans. And you've taken the time to pause and to thank God for the gift that you have been given to play this game with people that you care about, and to have the health and the opportunity to be able to enjoy this particular victory. And I remember he looked at us and he says, we are not going to be people to where just because it didn't work out, just because we've lost instead of won, just because we've experienced failure today instead of victory today, we're not going to be people that stray away from the values that brought us here. And so right now in this moment, there's no lying around. There's no sitting feeling sorry for yourself. Right now in this moment, your job is to go show respect for your opponent, to go thank your fans, and to praise God for the opportunity and the gift that you had to come out here and play today. And then he said this,
And it was a lesson that I didn't know would ever come back to me, but it did. Where he looked out and he said, "Man, I want you to understand something." He said, "Whether you win or whether you lose, always be thankful and grateful and positive and praise God." He said, "Take this to life. Whether you are lying in bed dying of cancer, or whether you are as healthy as an ox and able to contribute great things in this world, always be grateful. Always thank God for the opportunities that you've had and give him praise." Now, in that moment, I didn't realize how powerful that was going to be. But I remember the moment that came back to me. I remember the telephone call I got from my wife. She was pregnant and everything had been going well. Everything was completely normal. She went down for a checkup with her doctor. And unfortunately, when they did the ultrasound showed that the baby's heart was no longer beating. She had miscarried. She called completely devastated from that doctor's office, asking me to come down and be with her. And I remember in that moment, hadn't experienced a loss that close before. We had a young, kind of growing family. Things were going really well. And now all of a sudden that was shaken in this instant. And I remember driving from my office down to that doctor's office to comfort my wife. And you know the voice in my head that God sent me? It was a voice of my coach. It was that voice that said, whether the baby is healthy as can be, or whether there's been a miscarriage, be thankful, be grateful, be gracious to others, and praise God. And it was in that moment that I was able to pull myself together and turn around and minister to my wife. And it's in that moment that we've been able to then work with so many other couples that have struggled with experiencing the same sort of experiences that we've had in terms of having children. It was a lesson out of failure. My career wasn't long. It was pretty short. My friends give me a hard time for only spending one season playing. That season, we went 21-1. And I'll tell you this, I learned a whole lot more from the 1 than any lessons that I learned from the 21. You see, failure is counterintuitive. And if we appreciate that about failure, and if we begin to look at the other side of failure, it will give us a different perspective, and we will learn lessons that change our life and perhaps can launch us to new levels of success and help us in those very difficult moments as well. Failure is also paradoxical. And if you think about it, you got to kind of understand that there is kind of two sides to failure. And at times, it seems like the lessons of failure can be contradictory. But I want you to reflect with me on this for just a second, especially if you look at failure as a prelude to success. And so if you think about failure for just a second, success comes from both fearing and not fearing to fail. So let's unpack that for just a second. Success comes from both fearing and not fearing to fail. Now, notice that if we are just consumed by our fear of failure, we're probably not going to experience the levels of success that we ultimately could. Because if we're so scared and our goal in life is to not fail, then the chances are we're not going to try very many things. We're not going to be as bold and courageous as we possibly could be. Failure is going to hold us back. And it's not even failure that will hold us back. It's the fear of failure that will hold us back. You see, failure, I don't think holds us back. I think it moves us forward. That's what the title of this podcast is all about. But the fear of failure, now that's different. That can be something that holds us back in a very, very substantial way. So,
As we think about success coming from failure, notice that the fear of failure can be very limiting. But I also want us to understand that the fear of failure can also be that which causes us to be successful. Because the fear of failure is motivating. The fear of failure, wanting to win instead of losing, wanting to be successful and make the business work, as opposed to having to deal with the fact that it didn't work. Those kind of things can be great motivators for us. And again, a healthy perspective of failure, I think, instead of limiting us, it actually gives us the courage to do more than we could ever imagine. I remember graduating from law school. The gift you get in graduating law school is you get to take the bar exam. And the bar exam is this absolutely miserable 2 or 3 day experience that you've got to spend about 6 weeks or so preparing for. It really starts on kind of the Monday after you graduate from law school. And many times, as you think about the bar exam, the people who struggle with the bar exam are the people who end at the very top of their law school class and the people who end up at the very bottom of their law school class. The people who end up at the bottom of their law school class, they struggle because they perhaps just don't quite have what it takes in order to pass the bar. Those at the top, the reason that they struggle, in my opinion, is because they don't take it serious enough. They've experienced so much success that they get to a place to where perhaps they think they don't have to work as hard and they can still be successful on the bar exam. But the bar exam has humbled many, many people. And it's in light of that that I feared so much failing the bar exam. I feared the moment where I'd be sitting in my office at a law firm as a young lawyer and have the moment where I had to try to sort out or I had to try to explain how it is that I failed, not knowing what that would mean for my job in terms of being paid to be a lawyer where I couldn't even get licensed. And because of that failure, I absolutely worked my tail off to pass that test. I put every ounce of energy I had into it. And by the grace of God, I passed. But I'll never forget that lesson as well. And I valued that fear of failure because that fear of failure caused me to, at 9 o'clock at night, when everyone was going to bed, to find the energy and the discipline to go spend another 3 hours studying. I wouldn't have done it other than the fear of failure. And so failure is paradoxical. It can limit us, but at the same time, it can motivate us. It all depends on how it is that we approach failure and how we use failure and how we see failure. I want to encourage you, and I hope that this podcast encourages you, for failure to become a great tool for you to be able to experience great things in life. And then the last thing that I think is really, really important, perhaps a bit more of a popular statement on failure that you'll see out there, and that is that failure is inevitable. And I think it's really, really important as we start this podcast journey together to recognize that. The people that we're bringing in, these will be people that have reached great levels of accolades and success, but they haven't done it without failure. But we're also going to bring in pretty simple folks, folks like you and I, folks that are just in the grind day to day, and folks that are taking some of those failures that you and I will experience and teaching us in terms of how to use those failures and transform them into something that can be very useful. And so really the question when we fail is, how will we respond to it? How is it that that failure will shape us? Will that failure cause us to quit? Or will that failure launch us to do more? As I think about failure, I don't think failure is that damaging. I think there are consequences to it. I think what's far more damaging, though, is quitting. I've heard some people say it's much better to be a failure than a quitter. I think there's a lot of truth to that statement. But boy, a misunderstanding of failure or an unhealthy view of failure, it can cause us to quit. I hope that this podcast encourages you to stick with things, and as a result of that, to be able to overcome failure. But to recognize that we're all going to fail. It's early February here, and it's about this point every year where people's New Year's resolutions begin to break down. In fact, if you look at the stats, 80% of people who set New Year's resolutions will have failed in keeping those resolutions by the 1st of February every year. By the time you get to the end of the year, we're talking north of 95% of people have failed. Almost every New Year's resolution that people set ultimately doesn't get accomplished. But by going through the process, there's value. It makes us better, but we've got to recognize that failure is going to be part of the journey. The irony that I think successful people experience is that they actually have more failures in their life than they do successes. You see, in order to rise into a category of being successful, it really only takes one success. It's one thing that launches someone. It's one business that works really, really well. It's one particular moment where they lead through a difficult journey. And as a result of that, there is success and someone is identified as being successful. But the reality is that for many successful people, in addition to that 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 successes, there is that many more failures that are part of their story. It's certainly true in my experience. In my work, I've been asked to do a lot of entrepreneurial things for Lipscomb University and to start and pursue new ideas. Spark is one of the ideas that I've had the privilege of being able to pursue. But there's been many others as well. And there are a number of those ideas that are programs that frankly no longer exist. They didn't work. They failed. Let's call it for what it is. But there are also other programs that have been quite successful and have been able to contribute to the institution. But it's important to recognize that as we travel this journey, we are going to fail. And the question for us is not, do we fail or do we not fail? We want to fail, and we want to fail fast, and we want to fail in a way where we can limit the damage around it, but we want to make sure to extract those lessons that can change our life. So to wrap this up, there are 3 things that I've observed about failure that I think it's valuable for every leader to know. First, failure is counterintuitive. We've got to recognize that there's another side to failure. Second, failure is paradoxical. The same thing that failure does for us that can be a challenge is also the thing that can be a great opportunity. And the last thing is that failure is inevitable. If we're not failing, we're probably not doing enough. Failure is part of the journey of every successful person.